This is San Francisco.
It's Toshio, and today I'm going to talk to Hazel about public records that show the hypocrisy and lack of humanity of local politicians like Mayor London Breed and the Castro supervisor Raphael Mandelman, who never fail to use their own optical diversity as excuses to be assholes. These are politicians who get off on punching people who are already down, especially when they think it'll help them gain political clout. So in their social media and in their speeches, they use this illusion of scourges of blood-hungry, anonymous poor people as a scapegoat for every disaster that they themselves cause. The rest of us can sometimes find out what they're actually thinking through public records requests, like the texts that they send on their work phones. Anyone with an email, so you and I, can request public records from any local politician or public department through the Sunshine Ordinance, which is like the local version of the federal FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. This doesn't guarantee you're going to get anything back, of course, because like the SFPD has a whole public relations department, including someone whose job is basically to fend off public records requests from being sunshined. If the office doesn't want to comply, you're forced to sue. But of course, these offices depend on the fact that most people, including most journalists, don't have the money to hire lawyers to do that. It's also kind of nuanced because there are definitely people in politics who get off on being bad in public. You know, this is the type of person who never wants to admit that they've done wrong and apologize, but instead, they'll double down and say, what are you going to do about it? And of course, some of these people are going to use some of their personal cell phones for the extra dirty stuff. Sometimes you can get back information, though, that is useful in revealing or at least reinforcing how politicians are essentially paid liars who, again, are ready to blame anything they've done wrong on people who are unhoused and down and out. Wanted to thank Christian for throwing down on the Patreon. If you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/sadfrancisco. You can also find past episodes there as well. Today we have Hazel here to talk about some of the work that she's done using the Sunshine Act, which is like San Francisco's version of the Federal Freedom of Information Act, to uncover things that some of our local politicians and police, how they feel about the rest of us. This is something that I've had to do for some of the journalism that I've done. And it can be really helpful when you feel like you're being gaslit by these politicians to find out that, yes, in fact, they feel a certain way about an issue and we have the receipts to show it. Hazel, could I have or ask you to intro yourself?
Yeah. Hi, Hazel. I'm a socialist organizer here in San Francisco. And like you mentioned, do a lot of public records work, mostly centered around homelessness and criminalization here in the city.
I became familiar with your work around London Breed's text to the police to make sure that she's not in the vicinity of unhoused people. These are texts that were later cited in the now ongoing lawsuit by the Coalition on Homelessness against the city, in which the coalition, is calling out people, including London Breed, for basically their cruelty against unhoused people and the war that City Hall seems to be battling against people with the least in San Francisco. To that end, I was going to ask you about that treasure trove of texts. But first, I wanted to start with, what was the first thing that you ever used the Sunshine Act to reveal?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, like I mentioned, I'm an organizer in San Francisco. So in like 2018 to 2020, that kind of 2 year range, I was doing a lot of specifically mutual aid work around homelessness, along with folks at the DSA San Francisco Homelessness Working Group. Just want to shout them out. During that work, we would obviously be talking to houseless people a lot. About their experience with the city, which was largely at best neglect and more commonly and at worst harsh criminalization in the form of having their belongings taken and being displaced, right, during homeless sweeps, what the city calls encampment resolutions. Around that time, I started to be on Twitter more, for better or worse, and was posting about these stories and the political conditions underlying them. And also would just talk to advocates, right? Like people at the Coalition on Homelessness or whatever, who would talk about what they understood the city to be doing around criminalization. And as I talked about this more, people mentioned to me, hey, like you might find public records to be enlightening here. We know that, for example, the Department of Public Works is supposed to be documenting the belongings that they take, for example. And so you might be able to get records of that. But not a lot of that work was actually happening. I became very interested in public records work as a tool for organizing. That was kind of the first draw for me. And so before I actually filed anything, I started looking into what already existed, because a lot of the websites, for example, that you can use to file public records requests have the results of old requests there. So actually the mayor's texts, the first ones that I publicized, were not from a request that I made. They were from a request that someone else made for a totally, well, I'll say just a different purpose. Like that person was filing a request, and I cite them in my Twitter if people are curious, but they were making a broad communications request just for general messages between the mayor and other department heads. But I was looking for something specific, right? Which was like criminalization and homelessness specific communications. And so I found those text messages between Breed and the Chief Scott, the chief of police, pulled them out as significant and publicized them. And once those got a lot of attention, I kind of realized at least the media power of public records requests, but then also this organizing potential for them as well, where, understanding what's happening in the background can really inform your work as an organizer. So actually, my first request to answer the question was a duplicate of that one that I found. I copied it verbatim, and I changed the dates. And I was like, just give me these same messages, but for the last 3 months instead of, that the original request was like an older amount of time. And so I got a whole new batch of texts and publicized those. And then from there, the public records work started snowballing. I started to understand the nature of criminalization in San Francisco more, which led to me focusing more on meteor data. Like, in other words, I started to understand, for example, that the Department of Emergency Management kept these encampment resolution schedules of when they do sweeps, where they do sweeps. The Department of Public Works had these bag and tag logs, they call them, which catalogs what they steal from people. That, the Department of Homelessness had these spreadsheets of how many beds they set aside for people. So I requested all of this data and started, putting puzzle pieces together, which, and just promoting other things that I would find that I thought would be noteworthy for folks. And that work led to a lot of stuff. It led to the underlying data used by the lawsuit that you referenced, which is a lawsuit against the city for violating the 4th and 8th Amendments. Yeah, and then, just countless examples of city officials, supervisors, et cetera, criminalizing homeless people on behalf of businesses or VIPs. So yeah, just kind of snowballed from there.
This is, to be clear, happening under a mayor who says that under her administration, she's never asked for sweeps, that the city just does not conduct sweeps. Those of us who live anywhere in central San Francisco can see these things happening day to day, but I do find that it can be so helpful to just show the city has these schedules for the sweeps that they conduct. So much of the work is poring over these documents that they send, because they'll send back, when you use the Sunshine Ordinance, you can sort of send them dates and then they'll send you everything that they have on a topic or keywords. And of course, having like a huge tranche of documents come to you all at once can be kind of overwhelming. But if you spend the time, as you have, to go through them, there are some nuggets that, reveal themselves often to be useful in organizing. You mentioned people's possessions being taken. Also wanted to shout out a project called Stolen Belonging. You can link it in the show notes. Very, very long list of all of the missing items that people have had confiscated just because they were living on the streets. From this trove of texts between London Breed and the police, could you mention any greatest hits, or when I say greatest hits, I mean the most revealing texts that you came across?
Sure. Breed would just kind of walk around and go about her day and send these curt messages directly to the chief of police, telling him to remove homeless people, as she went about her day. So, for example, in one text, she tells the chief to come get someone who's sleeping on a bench, seemingly just because she doesn't want to see them while she's eating lunch. So the text just says, "Man sleeping on bench. Can someone come ASAP? I'm in the area having lunch." And then literally 2 minutes later, because you can see the timestamps, the chief personally texts, "Copy, we're sending a team." And they send, the city deploys a team of police to bother someone sleeping on a bench. There's no mention in these texts of services. And by the way, no peep from anyone else on the text thread, which included at the time the head of the Department of Homelessness, who in a better world would be deployed instead to help get that person into housing or something like that. But yeah, that's kind of the way that it operates. There's another text that's Breed was really focused on the 800 block of Market for a few reasons. So she says, that's the one block that needs to be clean, with 3 exclamations. And she calls it, quote, "our bread and butter," clearly implying that this is an area with tourism, an area that's important for business. It would get bad publicity. But she actually ordered 5 sweeps of that block in the run-up to the 2019 DNC event in the area, the Democratic Convention. After the event, people were packed into, according to Politico, John's Grill, which is right around the corner from that block. And we're talking Nancy Pelosi was there, the Secretary of State was there, Lieutenant Governor was there. John's Grill, by the way, owned by John Constan, who is a Breed donor and who also requested Breed to sweep the area outside of his restaurant, which she made happen very quickly. But anyway, you get an idea of kind of both her mode of governance, right? So she's there to, respond to business interests primarily, right? Not to take care of people. There's another text. This one's about crime more broadly, but she says, quote, "Perception is everything, and it looks like the city doesn't care," which I think really, again, sums it up. The issue here is the perception, right, of the city, making sure that perception is conducive to businesses operating, right, to capitalism, not to actually taking care of people or making sure services are available.
Yeah, it's the optics matter more than the reality. It's so sad. Right now, this week, it's Pride when we're recording this. And I mean, for years now, people have been recording and documenting how the city is sweeping a lot of people the week prior to Pride as tourists descend upon San Francisco. As we know from the city's own reporting around who is unhoused in the city, people who are queer and trans are way overrepresented among people who are unhoused. So that's in large part who is getting swept during the week of Gay Pride. As you mentioned, talking about how the bread and butter of what the city is about from Breed's perspective is kind of a spotless downtown appearing to be some metropolitan area. And it's not about who is the public who lives in these areas, it again goes back to this idea of how do we appear to be hospitable to these guests who might be like heads of states that might come out for the Democratic National Convention or the Super Bowl. So I also wanted to ask you about this more recent issue happening in the Castro, the Eureka Springs Library branch in the Castro is shutting off its public Wi-Fi at 5 p.m. Could you speak a little bit about what's happening there?
Yeah, definitely. So in this case, just to give you a little bit of background, the conversation about the Wi-Fi was actually pulled out of a broader swath of emails that I had requested. I wasn't even looking for this. I didn't know that it was happening. In this case, I was running public records requests to look into. So this is District 8 in San Francisco, right? Like you said, includes the Castro, also includes my neighborhood. So I live in District 8. The supervisor here is Supervisor Mandelman. I was looking into criminalization efforts by Mandelman. He has a history of fervently supporting homeless sweeps. He proudly admits that he does it on video. He vocally opposed the injunction, which came from this lawsuit. The injunction says you can't be sweeping people if you don't have enough shelter.
Right.
The city's finding ways around that, but you're not supposed to anyway. And in response, Mandelman put forward legislation to hastily shove people into inadequate shelter so that the city would be allowed to sweep people. So in his rhetoric around this legislation, he really emphasizes that his primary goal here is, not to house people, but to enable the city to sweep and remove people from site. That's what prompted my search into records and communications to see what's happening with that work right now on his end. So while searching through those records, I found this conversation between him, Mandelman, his aide, the police, and the library, and maybe 3, 4, 5 constituents who were all planning to basically deprive people of internet around the Eureka Valley Library in order to displace homeless people from the neighborhood. Yeah, this idea is not new, it turns out. The previous District 8 supervisor looked into this as well as a result, again, of a few neighbors complaining. And those neighbors, I think this was 2017, had talked to the press about the idea, et cetera. These emails revealed that Mandelman himself was actually pushing for this, saying, yeah, I will put pressure on the library. Great idea. It's extremely messed up. The library itself was pushing back for a while, pushing back against Mandelman's office, saying, we actually did a study back when the old supervisor asked us about this. The study said, first of all, there's no link between Wi-Fi and crime that we can see, but also, importantly, we don't even understand what that link would be. And this is now me, Hazel,
right.
talking, also confusing why that matters in the first place. Why, you know what I mean? It's a lot. There's a long history in San Francisco of depriving people of services because you link it to crime, which is a very bizarre logic. The city's done that with bathrooms before, with water, with all kinds of basic needs. So in this case, San Francisco, one of the tech capitals of the world, a few months ago also just rolled out this digital equity drive, right, to bridge the digital divide or whatever across race, across income.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. With the, things like public Wi-Fi, the argument for giving companies these huge contracts to provide cities with public Wi-Fi, a large part of that argument is, like you said, bridging the digital divide, because in study after study, we see that people who don't have as much easy access to Wi-Fi and cell phones, computers are not going to, on average, be making as much as people who do have access to those things. It's the height of hypocrisy when you look at someone like Raphael Mandelman calling for the branch in the Castro of the public library to turn off the public Wi-Fi, keyword being public, because, ostensibly, if you're unhoused, you're part of the public. So it's just really this two-tiered system that they seem to be wanting to push.
100%. And, you see this in the records that were released. Immediately, you see homeless people responding, backing up. Eventually, the library complied. The library met with Mandelman's office, and the day after they met with Mandelman's office, they shut off the Wi-Fi at night. After pushing back for a while, after saying there's no link, doing the study, re-evaluating the study, and saying we stand by our original findings, saying both that there's no link between Wi-Fi and crime, but also that, our purpose, we're committed to a free and equitable access to information, they say. And but then they meet with Mandelman and they yield and they disable the Wi-Fi. And the records show that this had a real impact on people. Like houseless people were messaging or were emailing the library saying, hey, like we were using that, and like we were using it for like really critical reasons, like someone who was getting sober and needed access to services was not able to because this Wi-Fi was shut off. So I think, it's really easy to like abstract this, but this is another element of the power of public records is that it makes things really concrete really quickly. Like I said, the library did comply. Since then, there have been like a few developments. The records got some coverage, right, by KQED and Mission Local, and Fox Media's The Verge touched on it. And then I started an email campaign to turn the Wi-Fi back on. So the library got a flood of emails asking for that to happen. So far, nothing. They have not changed their tune. There's also a push from the Eureka Valley Neighborhood Association to turn it back on as well. It seems like, the political conditions in the city shifting as far right as they have recently. It feels like the library thinks that they have cover to not respond to this pressure, in spite of the fact that many more people, as far as I can tell, have asked for the library to be on than off at this point. But yeah, not the right people, I guess.
I sent an email as well. And yeah, the response, of course, was like just the most vague form letter saying the library will continue to work with the Office of District 8 Supervisor Mandelman to consider how we can continue to deliver the highest possible level of service and best meet the needs of neighborhood residents for access to library services. Just a whole lot of nothing. This is really, from my point of view, Mandelman showing these like few neighbors that have complained to him about this issue that here I'm doing something when in fact, the thing that he's doing is actually just further marginalizing people who have very little. I really appreciate your work with getting the info out there and getting the receipts out there for these politicians who are trying to act like they care when in fact they do care about a very, very small niche number of San Franciscans who, maybe are their donors.
That's right. If it's okay, I just wanted to add a little context to this because, in the course of the public records work, there's some less headline grabbing stuff in there just because it doesn't involve the mayor, but just to drive home how systemic, what you just described is in San Francisco. If you pick a city official with very, very few exceptions, there's a record of their collusion in the criminalization of homeless people, which really just gets to this idea, that you were talking about, that like, the purpose of government in San Francisco, like under capitalism, is really to manage its contradictions. So in this case, we're not providing people with housing. So we have this visible poverty. And so we spin up entire interdepartmental agencies to deal with the consequences of that, which in this case, that manifests here in what's called HSOC, which is like the Healthy Streets Operations Center, which is like a joint operation, right? And just countless resources going to shuffling people from neighborhood to neighborhood. And yeah, so you end up seeing like the head of the Department of Homelessness, Jeff Kositsky at the time, just straight up saying, hey, we need more enforcement. We need to deprive people of bathrooms if we want a tent-free environment, right? Or you get supervisors just devoting their office's resources to making sure this encampment is removed. And so, yeah, the entire city kind of, hovers around that purpose. And yeah, it's really devastating.
It's all about like publicizing this stuff, like making more people aware. I guess it was like somewhat heartening to find out just how unpopular London Breed is specifically. People, I guess, representing like the whole, like from the left to the right, are not fans of our mayor currently. But some of these like smaller players, I guess you could say, it's harder to keep track of all of these people. Not everyone has that many hours in the day to know the names of every last department head. And so it does fall on people like yourself to get the word out about people like Jeff Kositsky, for example, like you just mentioned, who was the former Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing head. And then after he stepped down, of course, he was kind of deposed. And then, of course, he, fell sideways into urban alchemy. In many ways is just another way for the city to shuffle funds and put them into another nonprofit but non-public contractor that has ties to all of these people around the mayor, including some of the people who were arrested and are now in prison for the FBI stings that have been happening around.
That's right. Also, by the way,
corruption.
on those text messages, the Mohammed Nuru arrested by the FBI, former head of the Department of Public Works, also on those text messages between Breed and the chief of police. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Ooh, okay.
Spices that up a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure she's like highly aware if the FBI isn't in direct contact, being like, watch yourself, because like she dated the guy, Mohammed Nuru, who was the former head of the Department of Public Works years ago. And she had to pay a fine because she, I think it was like a failure to report the use of some of her funds that went towards paying Mohammed Nuru to like fix an old car of hers. Pretty sketchy. Thank you for keeping track of some of these people who are making a lot of decisions that affect a lot of us and involve so much in terms of the resources of the city to either like help people or cause more hindrances that keep people unhoused, keep people from being able to like just access the bare necessities that people need to live. I really, appreciate you taking the time out to speak with me. And I was wondering if you could let people know where to find you online or otherwise.
Yeah, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it. So you can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is diz_h. It's DIZZ_H. And yeah, I just want to throw this out there. If you're a leftist organizer and you have a group that wants to learn how to do public records work, feel free to DM me. Twitter, I have a little like training course that I'm happy to run for y'all. And yeah, just to want to really emphasize what you said earlier of like the impact of this work is significant, I think, on creating institutional knowledge in the city about these horrible things that I think does last in people's minds. So, when the mayor is just straight up saying sweeps don't happen, the people kind of know better. But there's also this, I think, really important role for public records work in organizing work, whether it's like short-term political reforms or, longer-term, whatever, strategic aid, base building work, understanding the landscape of, power in San Francisco and how it changes over time, and understanding kind of the, like in a sense, public records constitute like the paper trail of the capitalist state. So if you want to understand how that state works, public records are really an essential tool there.
Yeah. And as long as these politicians are not bringing their texts over to, WhatsApp in the vanishing mode, we should be able to get their more unadulterated thoughts on issues.
Yeah. I have some bad news for you there, but that maybe we'll talk about that another time. But the mayor no longer text messages anymore. So,
of course.
that's real.
Yeah. And I mean, when politicians are going to these extra lengths, you have to assume that they're going to be saying things that they don't want their constituents to be hearing or reading. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this work, it's hard to measure how much it's affecting people, but you can look at like the amount of times that some of these texts that you uncovered have ended up in the media. And then of course, like in the case of the Coalition on Homelessness court case, I mean, that show the cruelty of the system that they're running if they continue to do what they're doing.
Thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Sad Francisco is a podcast produced by Caitlin Wood and Toshio Moronic. If you like the show, please go to patreon.com/Sad Francisco. See you next time in Sad Francisco.